I will be exploring the outsider representation using the film movement of German Expressionism in the 1990 American film Edward Scissorhands, directed by Tim Burton, with the 2008 Swedish film Let the Right One In, directed by Thomas Alfredson. Both films are similar in the way that they are heavily influenced by elements of German Expressionism in their individual ways, primarily mise-en-scène, to present the protagonists as outsiders. Furthermore, they make a good choice for this comparative study, as they are both from contrasting contexts and time periods from the original German Expressionism movement and from each other, making the exploration of the outsider representation in these films more interesting and in-depth. The German Expressionism movement developed due to Germany's isolation after World War I, and feelings of anxiety and uneasiness were present. It is defined as the depiction of reality that is widely distorted for emotional effect, and aimed to convey subjective experiences of main subjects, placing emphasis on unnatural atmospheres. Drawing primarily on German Expressionism elements in films Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, distinctive features of this movement include themes of insanity, horror, and death, with abstract sets and distortion conveying inner emotional feelings. Edward Scissorhands was set in a 1950s American suburbia, while Let the Right One In was set in a 1980s Swedish suburbia. Alfredson stated that this was intended, as 1980 Sweden was another kind of society and much more silent. In 1950s America, middle-class culture developed, and around 11 million suburbs were built. The film was also inspired by Burton's childhood feelings of isolation and being unable to communicate to people while growing up in the suburbs. During the 1980s, Sweden saw an increase of immigrants entering its country. Moreover, Swedish suburbs had negative stigmas attached to them after the 1970s due to crime rates and drug usage. Therefore, while Americans conceive suburbs as a sign of affluence, this is different in Sweden, heavily influencing the film's visual settings. Dark eye makeup makes Edward's complexion gothic-looking, resembling Caesar in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, also similar to Ellie's pale complexion. Gothic makeup in German Expressionism was typically used to reflect characters' inner feelings and states of mind. Furthermore, Edward's dark costume contrasts against the pastel-clothed townfolk. Just how Ellie's baggy costume and disheveled hairstyle is very different to the ethnic Swedish types portrayed in the film. Being largely the only character with dark hair, Ellie is marked as an outsider and adopts the migrant archetype, reflecting the increase of migrants in 1980s Sweden. This was also suggested at the start of the film, as the ease in which Hakan and her settle into the suburbs suggests familiarity with this routine. Overall, both protagonists' wardrobe designs showcases their marginalization and outsider status within their societies. The mise-en-scène in Edward's castle is heavily stylized through distortion to accentuate Edward's isolation, unlike the more natural atmosphere created by the Swedish winter in Let the Right One In. Chiaroscuro lighting helps introduce Edward. This is similar in Let the Right One In's murders, where low-key lighting emphasizes gruesome connotations to accentuate Ellie's stark difference amongst others. In Edward Scissorhands, shadows accentuate his exaggerated hand positioning, isolating him in comparison to the high-key ambient town lighting. Bo Welsh, production designer, said suburbs were painted in faded pastels and window sizes reduced to make it look a little more paranoid, mimicking German Expressionism themes of distortion. In Let the Right One In, gray tones evoked from the snow and bleak housing estates create visual impact by emphasizing the isolated, negative lifestyle of the suburbs during this time. This is dissimilar to Edward Scissorhands that uses color juxtaposition to show isolation, a theme influenced by the director's own childhood experiences. Unrealistic body gestures and distortion was another German Expressionism element that conveyed feelings of insanity or isolation. Both films use the symbolic motif of hands. As German Expressionism favors artificiality over realism, the motif of Edward's hands preventing him from blending in is repeated throughout. This is a more exaggerated, unified motif compared to the symbolic and varied motif in Let the Right One In. In the dinner scene, naturalistic acting of awkward and uncertain movements show how his hands prevent him from assimilating with others. As a result, his outsider portrayal is emphasized, as Edward struggles to conform to the typical behaviors of the other town members. In Let the Right One In, the poster of an upside-down thumbs placed on the window could be a metaphor for the construction of a barrier from society to emphasize their outsider status. However, Let the Right One In's motif of hands has dissimilar denotations throughout, though it still falls under the theme of isolation. An example is when Ellie places her hand on the glass window when watching Oscar from the outside, suggesting the separation she is experiencing, showing her outsider portrayal in a way that differs to the previous example. Both films also have a deeper meaning to the outsider archetype. Edward's hands are unintentionally hostile to himself and others, depicting him as a victim of both his hands and of bullying and exclusion. This contrasts previous villainous outsiders such as Dracula, showing the progression from original German Expressionism films. Archetypes of vampires in films often have evil connotations, like Count Orlok in Nosferatu. However, Ellie is also depicted as a victim of her characteristic of a vampire, as she only kills out of necessity. This was shown when she tells Oscar, "I do it because I have to," and "be me a little." The film wants us to understand how Ellie is doing this for her survival, eliciting feelings of sympathy. The real villains may be Oscar's bullies, and the film may be implying there is not a big difference in the vampire's predatory, evil way compared to the way of the Swedish people. Let the Right One In favors a shallow depth of field with a larger aperture, whereas Edward Scissorhands uses more deep focus shots. Extreme close-ups of Ellie and Oscar's faces separates them from the background of the world, showcasing their outsider status. As Van Hoytema said, the danger of the film exists in everyday situations, so cinematography was unobtrusive, highlighting German Expressionism themes of horror. In Edward Scissorhands, the point of view shot of the town suggests this was Edward's perspective of the suburbs, established from the previous low-angle shot of his castle, which highlights his segregation. Though traditionally German Expressionism camera work was more abstract, such as Dutch angles, both films are different as they use a more modern approach with different apertures and angles for better visual aesthetic and effect. In Let the Right One In, an eyeline match is employed to display Ellie murdering a man. This colors her outsider portrayal extremely, encouraging viewers to linger on her grotesque actions. With Edward, a shot-reverse shot is used between him and the family members to show the stark contrast in actions, and gain audiences' empathy as he is depicted as an outsider. However, this may be different than when employed in previous German Expressionism films, where this was used to increase the audience's fear of the protagonist. Both films accede to an invisible, simple editing style, another feature of German Expressionism. This was done in order to place more emphasis on the visual styles, such as mise-en-scène, and hence allow the audience to further comprehend the outsider portrayal. Alfredson focused on using limited non-diegetic background music, saying the silence is very Swedish. Meanwhile, Edward Scissorhands uses non-diegetic background music to emphasize the storyline. In Let the Right One In, the murders are quiet, accompanied with ambient and diegetic sound to create unforgettable depictions of Ellie. This is achieved differently in Edward Scissorhands, where cheerful music that transitions into darker tones implies Edward's difference and sets up his isolation. In conclusion, both films use elements of German Expressionism, primarily mise-en-scène, to convey outsider portrayals. The cultural context of both films assists heavily in telling their stories. The suburbia and contrasting geographical locations depicts the outsider portrayal in different ways. Sweden's negative stigma further sets up Ellie's portrayal amongst the isolation, whereas the affluent and colorful American suburbs makes it more shocking when a darker undertone of bullying and exclusion is revealed. Furthermore, Edward Scissorhands focuses on using the straightforward subjectivity of color to represent isolation, whereas Let the Right One In favors more symbolic meanings. While initially the idea of a more monstrous side of humanity belonging to us was more subtle, it has now been symbolically incorporated into the film movement. It seems that both directors want us to see ourselves in the protagonists, to emphasize with them and understand their actions. This perhaps urges us as a society to be more aware of our actions towards others, especially the cruelty of isolation and bullying. Overall, both Ellie and Edward are not villains, but instead are just misunderstood by the society and therefore classified as outcasts.